Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Logan Arliss from Illinois Aviation Academy. Thank you for joining me as we indulge into another Webinar Wednesday event. Before we get going and introduce our guest for tonight, I would like to give a little brief announcement. So again, we have our 18th annual Grass Field Landing Championship, September 20th, out at Rochelle Airport. Guys, breakfast is provided by Illinois Aviation Academy. All are welcome. Planes are still available. You guys can sign up by calling the office or in the lobby up front. We'll meet at IAA 6:30 to 7. We'll be wheels up at about 7:30. Breakfast will be served from 7:30 till 9, and then we'll start doing our grass field landings at 8:30 through 11. Trophies will be awarded at 11, and then we'll depart and be back by DuPage by noon. Again, we'll be grading and judging on your ability to taxi, take off, fly a good rectangular traffic pattern, fly a nice approach into a landing where we'll have a spot that you'll try to touch down as soft as possible on the grass field. And as always, safety is judged as well. So come out, bring your A game, make sure you guys sign up, get on the schedule. It's going to be a great event. You won't want to miss it. And now I'm excited to present our guest for tonight, Lieutenant Colonel John Duray. Now, John Duray has been with the United States Air Force for some time. He started off as flying manned aircraft in the T-6, eventually moved into the U-28, where he was a pilot flying several missions, and then eventually became a flight instructor and a flight commander on the U-28. Then he shifted in his career and moved to unmanned aircraft, specifically working with the MQ-9 Predator drone as a pilot, and then eventually becoming an evaluator pilot and assistant director of operations on the MQ-9. Most recently, he's working out of Washington, D.C. in Nuclear Command and as a Nuclear Command and Control Officer at the National Military Command Center. So I'd like to bring John onto the call. As always, if you guys have questions, please feel free to comment below. We'll be monitoring and addressing the questions as the webinar goes. So let's bring John on. Hello, sir.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Great. Hey, before we get into it, I just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your day to share some of your knowledge with us, and also thanks for all that you do for our great nation.
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate it. My only question for you before we start is how do I get involved in that grass landing competition that's coming up? I feel like I should be awarded like a free entry or something like that for doing this.
Absolutely. So, man, you're welcome. You can take any one of our planes that you want.
All right. Okay. Just let me know what airport you're going to pick me up at, and we'll go from there.
Hey, sounds good. Why don't you fly one of your remote drones on up?
That's also an option. That's also an option.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Hey, so getting into it. So growing up, did you always have an interest in aviation, and what made you choose a military route?
Yeah, so the answer to that is no, which is a little non-standard, to be honest with you. I didn't grow up in any kind of a aviation family or have a military background or anything like that. And I wasn't one of those kids that when they were 5 was taken to an air show and kind of saw their first fighter and was like, oh, that's what I want to do with my life. That just wasn't me. I went to college to be a doctor. Really, I really wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon, and I did Air Force ROTC to help pay for school. And then my freshman year, spring break, my freshman year, I had a chance to go down to Tyndall Air Force Base. And just as luck would have it, was able to get in the back seat of an F-15 D model, which is the 2-seat trainer for the C model air-to-air fighter that we have. And, it was the best and worst experience of my life, all wrapped into one short hour. I think I threw up at least 5 or 6 times, if not more. I just stopped counting after a while. And I remember at one point just kind of being in the air and being like, if this was real war, I would rather just eject and take my chances on the ground right now than to continue to suffer through what we're doing up here. But, you land and, they drug me back into the car. And, about an hour later, you kind of look back and I was like, you know what, that was actually pretty cool. And I was like, I think I'd rather do that at this point in my life. I can always go to med school later, right? So I went back to my ROTC deck commander and just said, hey, sir, I know I've been in this pre-med track, but I think I want to fly. And he was like, oh, yeah, it's kind of what I figured you'd say after coming back from that. So that's kind of how I got started. And, I put in for a pilot slot and got one out of college. And then just kind of went from there, and went to pilot training, and we can talk more about that in a minute. But that's kind of how I got started in aviation, to be honest with you. And I didn't know anything about flying outside of that.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's awesome. So tell us about that journey that you went on with the United States Air Force, and you have a unique experience. You started manned and then eventually moved into unmanned aircraft. So
Yeah.
what does the training footprint look like for each, and the career path for each of those look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll kind of talk through what the man side looks like from a pilot training perspective for anyone out there that might be interested in doing that route. And then I'll kind of talk about my specific path that I took. So the way pilot training works is your first stop, as you go through all the medical screening stuff, which is, it sounds light, but it's a 2 or 3 day extravaganza down in San Antonio, Texas, where they poke and prod you and give you 36 different vision tests and everything else like that. And as long as you make it through that, you go to your first step. And again, this is the man pipeline called IFT, which is initial flight training. It's out in Pueblo, Colorado. And you basically fly a DA-20 for about 30 to 40 hours, do your first solo, things like that. And that really serves as almost like a screening program more than anything else, just to, some folks that might not be able to handle the air sickness aspect of it or something like that. And then as long as you make it through that, then you actually go to pilot training and start there. And so as you can see on the screen, the first aircraft that everyone flies together is the T6, and that's in the upper left portion there. And so everyone flies that for 6 months. And it's pilot training. It's fairly strenuous. It's pretty competitive. And so you're just, you take a lot of tests, you do a lot of flying, you have a couple check rods along the way. Obviously they have a lot of, pressure behind them and whatnot. And then at the end of those 6 months, they basically rack and stack you number 1 through 30 in the class, and then they vector you from there. And so the 3 tracks that we have now in pilot training are the fighter bomber track, in which you'll go to T-38, which is what you see in the bottom there. There's also the T-1 track, which is more for our heavy cargo guys. And then the 3rd track is helicopters, in which you'll go fly a UH-1 down at Fort Rucker. And so they literally take the top guy in the class and they say, okay, what track do you want to go to? And they just kind of go down with the allocation. A typical allocation in a class of 30 is 4 or 5 fighter bomber slots, 1 or 2 helo slots, and the rest T1 slots. And so you do that, and then you go to your platform breakout of T38s, T1s, or UH1s, and then you start all over again. And so you start at ground zero. Nothing you've done to that point counts. And so you start with a score of 0, and again you go through the competitive process of flying, competing with your class, things like that. And after about 6 months of that, then you have what's called drop night. And again, you get ranked number 1 through whatever in your class, and the Air Force gives them a certain number of allocations of fighters and bombers and tankers and whatnot. And within your respective platform, then you kind of pick, hey, here's what I want, and then this is what I want, and that sort of thing. And then from there, after that year, then you actually go to learn and train on the actual aircraft you were assigned at that point. That's all on the manned side. The unmanned side is pretty similar, different locations and a slightly shorter time frame, but pretty similar. And so you still go to IFT if you go to the unmanned RPA training. We call it URT now. And that's, again, out of Pueblo, flying in a DA-20. But then you go down to San Antonio and you go through something we call RIQ, which is RPA instrument qual. And you fly a T6 simulator on the ground for a ton of those sorties, and that's about 3 or 4 months long. And then you do another course there in San Antonio called RFC. And then you go out to New Mexico and you fly the MQ-9 for the first time out there. If you're going to fly the MQ-9, you do that for a couple months. And then you get sent out to your operational unit from there to get kind of further training for 3 or 4 months. So for my specific career kind of progression, what I did, I flew the T6 initially, then I went on to the T-38. And I initially had an F-16 out of pilot training. That was what I got on drop night, which I was stoked about. I was pumped. And I took it with the understanding that my follow-on training was going to be about a year-long wait. There's a little course they have you do before you go to F-16 training. It's called IFF, or Intro to Fighter Fundamentals. And I knew taking that, it was going to be about a year wait. So I thought, I'll stick it out and just hang around for a year and kind of wait for that. I'm okay with that. So fast forward about 6 months, I was about 6 months into my wait, and it wasn't a lot of fun because, when you're not in pilot training, but you're on the base, you get the leftover sorties. So you're flying about once every 2 or 3 weeks, which in a plane like the T-38 is just enough to be really bad at it. And so it wasn't a great time of flying in my life. And after those 6 months, they kind of cut my orders and they said, hey, we're backlogged more than we thought. So your 1 year wait is going to look more like an 18 to a 24-month wait to go to this further on training. And I was like, hey, I can't do that. I'm not one to sit around and wait. That's just not my style. And I had a good wing commander at the time that kind of took me under his wing and said, hey, just so you know, if you hold out and wait, there's just things you're not going to be able to do in your Air Force career if you want to do them, because you're going to be really behind your peers and everything else like that. And that's just kind of the cards you've been dealt. So I said, okay, what can I trade it for? What can I do? And they said, well, you can trade it for an MQ-9, a drone. And I was like, no, I'm never doing that ever. You can see the irony in this story. And I said, so no, I don't want that. What are my manned options? And they said, well, you can trade it for this plane called a U-28. And I was like, what's a U-28? And all the instructor pilots, because it was kind of brand new. It came online, 2007, 2008, which is about the time I was graduating pilot training. And all the instructors are like, we don't know. We actually have no idea what this thing is. We know it's got a turboprop on the front of it. We know it's based on a Pilatus PC-12, and we know they're deployed a lot. That's about the extent of what we know about this aircraft. And I was like, I'm looking to get into the fight. Let me take that one. And so I did, which sounds kind of simple, but to be honest, was kind of it's kind of a big deal. There's a lot of folks that looked at me like I was out of my mind, because they're like, you're trading an F-16 to go to a single engine turboprop aircraft. And I was like, yeah, but for me, it was kind of an easy decision, because I wanted to get in the fight and I wanted to do something. I've always heard more about the mission, I guess, than the platform that I did it from. And it's a little unique in some ways, but it was a pretty easy decision for me. So at that point, I went to Hurlburt Field, and where we had the U-28 training. And the ironic part, and I'll wrap this story up because I know this wasn't supposed to be my whole life story, but the ironic part was I went down there and I got there right about the time they flooded a whole bunch of folks to the community, the U-28 community. And so as soon as I got there, they're like, hey, we don't have a class date for you. You're going to be sitting here about a year until you start training. And I said, oh, that's about right. But the good news was in the waiting for that year, there was another special ops unit that kind of needed some help, that needed guys to fly some smaller aircraft in the Middle East for a little bit. And I kind of raised my hand for that when I was sitting there. And I went and did some things with those guys for a few months. And then I came back into the U-28 pipeline when I was done with that and started training. And then did that for about 5 years. From 09 to 14-ish down at Hurlburt.
That's awesome. Yeah, what a story, what a path. Now, we had one question come in. It says, is there any advantage to enlisting into the military already having a private pilot license? So I know I've talked to some military guys, and they're like, man, it's better to just come into the military clean, so we don't have to reteach you everything that you've already learned.
Yeah.
Is there any truth to that?
No, that's a really good question. So I would say this. There's probably a slight advantage to it. It is easier to compete for a pilot slot if you have your private pilot's license, because what that shows is it shows initiative. It shows that you're willing to kind of put forth the effort, and this is something you're taking seriously. That being said, I know many folks who got into the military first, and then while they were in the military, went and got their private pilot's licenses. And it's sometimes a lot cheaper that way, because there's all kinds of incentive programs out there for folks that are in the military. There's a lot of local flying clubs at many of the local flying bases. And so you'll have plenty of time to do that when you first come in. If that was something that somebody wanted to do, it gives you a little bit of an advantage. But again, once you enlist, if you want to enlist and come in, you could go ahead and do that once you were in the military at that point, and do that as well.
Awesome. Now, you mentioned a lot of the aircraft that you were able to fly, the T-6, the T-38. You've flown the C-208, PC-12, and the U-28. Which one was your favorite?
Yeah, so I feel like that's like asking me which kid's my favorite kid. None of them, right? They're all my favorites, which I say is true, but then there's reality. So I would say this. So the T-38 was incredible, right? Because it's just like a little miniature fighter jet. And I remember at one point during my T-38 training, we were holding short. It was a formation, and it was kind of towards the end of the program, so I felt a little bit more comfortable. And I was able just for a moment to kind of take a step back, which is hard to do, right? Because normally when you're in training, I mean, you're focused on what you have to do, right? I mean, it's like, here's what I got to do today. Here's my checklist. Here's my next step, because you don't want to die and you want to do well. And so, but I remember that moment being able to just like take a step back, and I'm sitting there by myself, solo in a T-38, and I look across, and there's, my buddy next to me. We're both like 23 years old, right? And here we are, we don't have like $1 to our name. We're flying these multi-million-dollar aircraft, and we're getting ready to, do a formation takeoff and go out and do loops together out in this airspace. And I'm like, just, if people would have known what I did growing up, like they would never have allowed this to happen at this point. No one would have trusted me to do this in any way, shape, or form. But I remember thinking that was pretty cool, because that plane could do about anything you wanted it to do. And we had a lot of fun flying that aircraft. It was fun. It was fast. It did a lot of cool things. I would also, if I had to, again, I don't want to pick from that list favorites, but from the man side of the house, I love the PC-12. And the difference between a PC-12 and a U-28, the U-28 is just a PC-12 that we've kind of gutted and put a lot of mission stuff into. But at its heart, it's still a PC-12. So on the squadron I was a part of, in addition to having the U-28s, we had a couple PC-12s as part of the unit, just so we could go out and do, IFR type flying, instrument flying, things like that. Because we could go into airfields that we couldn't with the U-28 due to some sensitive stuff we were carrying and things like that. So that's a great plane. And if I had an extra $4 million sitting around, I'd have one in a heartbeat. So we would take that plane, all across America and do all kinds of short field training and things of that nature. We'd go up to North Carolina and pick a couple of those runways up in the Appalachian Mountains. 24A, Jackson County is probably my favorite airport of all time, if I'm honest, because it's up just way high, right next to this golf course, and it just drops off at the end of both runways, and it's only like a little 3,000-foot runway, but we could get the plane in there. So we'd go up there and just put it down on brick one, throw it reverse, jump on the brakes, go down to the end, and do a little 3-point turnaround, and that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed those PC-12 flights because you could really get into some places that you otherwise just weren't going to be able to get into with some of the other aircraft that we had. So that's kind of my answer to that question right there.
Absolutely. Yeah, the PC-12 is awesome. I actually get to fly one here out of DuPage, and I say the same thing. If I ever hit the lottery, man, that's what I'm buying for sure.
Yeah.
So you're a little unique. You got to experience both the manned and unmanned side. So what operations currently utilize remote pilot aircraft in the United States Air Force?
Yeah, so right now, when we're talking RPAs, the Air Force has a few different RPAs, but normally what folks are talking about is the MQ-9. That's the one that we have kind of a predominance of. They're mostly used for what we call ISR. So that's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. On the intelligence side of the house, there's different levels of intelligence. So there are different types of intelligence. We have things like signals intelligence, which we call SIGINT. There's image intelligence, we call IMIT. There's human intelligence, we call HUMIT. The MQ-9 operates primarily in that SIGINT and IMIT realm of collection. The MQ-9 though also has a strike capability to it, a kinetic piece as well. So it's equipped like that. We also have other aircraft that are RPAs. Again, we don't have a lot of them. The RQ-4 kind of comes to mind. It also is an ISR type platform. But traditionally speaking, when we're talking about the MQ-9, it has been used almost exclusively in what we call the counter VEO fight, or the counter violent extremist organization fight. So the kind of the war on terror, that sort of fight. And so ever since 2001, when the MQ-1 kind of came into existence, and then subsequently the MQ-9, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, those have kind of been the mission sets that they've been focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like you were mentioning there. So it's come a long way in order to do the combat missions, like you were saying, since the early 2000s, the MQ-1 came out. So talk to us a little bit about the aircraft improvements, the technology improvements, training, and interoperability that we can now have with the MQ-9 versus where we started with the MQ-1.
Yeah, so the difference is tremendous. It really is, and I think I've talked about how it, the MQ-1 from 2001 compared to the MQ-9 of 2020, it's almost like comparing like a P-51 Mustang to an F-16 today. I mean, they truly are that different. And what's allowed us to do that, it is a lot of that technology piece. So, what we've been able to do specifically when the MQ-9 came online was we've been able to kind of reinvent that aircraft about every 6 months. And so that's in a traditional Air Force acquisitions realm, that is like instantaneous upgrades. It might not seem very quickly to the outside world, like 6 months seems like a long time, but in the traditional acquisition sense, that's moving at light speed. Mm-hmm. And so we've been able to take that aircraft, and we work really closely with the builders of the aircraft, with the folks that provide a lot of the technology that we use on the aircraft. And we're able to fly it and say, hey, it does this right now, but we really need it to do this a little bit better. Can you kind of get a fix for that? And then they're like, okay, let's talk and think about that. And then they'll come back with something. And they're like, hey, we like how it does this, but we don't like how, when we roll this way, this is happening, and we're trying to develop this capability. We just can't do it right now because the aircraft is limiting us. Can you get a fix for us? And so we have that conversation with them constantly. And about every 6 months, they come back and they're like, okay, here's your next fix. Here's your next iteration. And so we implement it, and then we go. And you times that over a 10-year period, and I mean, you just are rapidly changing what the aircraft is capable of. And so we've combined that technology with a lot of the training, and we've really put a lot of our heart and soul into how we train our RPA pilots. And we've really taken a vested interest in developing them as aircrew members and as airmen, and saying, hey, this isn't the idea that you're just going to sit here and the idea still persists a little bit, that you're just going to plug in some numbers and drink Mountain Dew and this is a video game. That couldn't be further from the truth. Like this is a combat aircraft. You're in a cockpit. And we want people to think like that. And so by just trying to change the culture a little bit and the mindset of some folks who were sitting there, we really got on the training piece of it. And we said, okay, let's get really good at increasing our efficiency with how we're using the aircraft. How else can we use it? Hey, what if we take more than one? What if we take a flight? What if we, lean back on our old Air Force roots and have a flight of fighters? What if we had a flight of MQ-9s? What could they do that would be different than what a singular MQ-9 could do? And then that interoperability, please. Hey, how can we plug in with all the other manned assets that are out there? Because we're not operating independently of them. How do we operate with them? How do we integrate with them? How do we push them our data? How do we get their data back? All that stuff matters in today's war. I think a lot of folks have called it, we're in an information fight, and that's true. And you need to be able to operate kind of at the speed of relevancy when you're on the battlefield, and that information is key. And so how do we plug and play with all the different aircraft that are out there to get that data flowing so that we're all seeing the same sight picture and we can make decisions based off that then?
Amazing. Yeah, we had a question come in on the chart here. So it says that the MQ-9 can operate for an endurance of 20 hours. And someone would like to know, what's the typical length of a remote pilot is piloting the aircraft for that mission before switching pilots? Or is 20 hours, do they rarely fly 20 hours?
No one's flying 20 hours. I can guarantee you that. Yeah, we have rules and regulations and AFIs that fortunately govern against that. So we'll probably talk about this in the future a little bit, but just to give a quick answer to that up front, generally speaking, on an average day, you're flying it called 4 to 6 hours, maybe 8. Rarely are we exceeding 8, and we never exceed 12. In the olden days, 12 was kind of the limit, and you saw that occasionally. That's just a long time, right? I mean, you're still flying an aircraft, and so that's a ton of time to be in the seat. Now, there was a breaks occasionally in that to go to the restroom, but regardless, if you're at the controls of something that's flying for 12 hours, you're there for a long time, and that isn't good, and that's not good, and that just doesn't make any sense from a risk mitigation standpoint. And so typically on that 20-hour mission, you're probably looking at about 4 to 6-ish hours of flying, maybe 8 on an average day. And so you'll have 2 to 3 crews then that'll cycle out for that mission, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fatigue will sit in after about 8 hours for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the manned versus unmanned. So as the MQ-9s are used more and more for combat missions and other missions in the United States Air Force, so what are the pros and the cons of each, and what situation would favor one over the other?
Yeah, so the great part about this question is that what we found is that the pros of the cons of a manned aircraft and an unmanned aircraft, they tend to overlap. In other words, what manned aircraft tend to be bad at, unmanned tend to be good at, and vice versa. So the ideal solution is always to have them melded and working together, because they tend to compensate for each other's weaknesses, we've come to find. Specifically to kind of dive into that a little bit. So what is an unmanned platform good at? Well, we just kind of talked about it, loiter time. No other manned aircraft is up there flying 20 hours for the most part. Some of our heavy cargos can do that, but they're swapping crews and things like that. But if we're talking about a mission set that's going to involve fighters or maybe tactical ISR like the U-28, you're not going to be able to loiter for that long. And so the MQ-9 has a huge advantage with that. One of the downsides though that an MQ-9 has is that although it can travel long distances, it has a large, what we'll call like a logistical footprint. And so to take it and pick it up and like say launch it from a new location, that's a huge heavy logistical lift for that. Whereas you take an aircraft like a U-28 or some of the other tactical ISR birds we have, and their ability to just throw a maintainer or two in the back, jump to a different airfield and operate out of there remotely for a few days, they can do it like that. And so they're a little bit more flexible with that. MQ-9, it's just you can't do it with the technology. There's a lot of technology that backs what we're able to do, and you can't just pick up and lay down fiber optic cable like tomorrow. That just doesn't work that way. So that's one of the disadvantages. Looking more on the tactical side of the house, an unmanned aircraft is very radio limited, the MQ-9 specifically. Manned aircraft tend to not have that problem. Again, specifically looking at some of the fighters and U-28s, they have more radios. Those radios are more reliable. And so you tend to have, it's better communication with the guys on the ground you're working with if you have a manned asset overhead than if you have an unmanned asset. And then kind of looking at one more piece of it, and this is something we haven't fully looked at exploiting yet, but one of the advantages of unmanned is that you can do what we call import talent into the cockpit. And what I mean by that is, the GCS is on the ground in a location. There's nothing to say that I can't put an expert in some specific tasking over the shoulder of a guy that's flying to help him out. So let's say, for example, we were doing a mission where we had a CV-22 that was coming in, one of our tilt rotor aircraft that we have. And we had to kind of do a scan to try to find like an LZ for them to land in. Well, you know, we get trained in that, but you know who's really, really good at what would look like a good HLZ? And a CV-22 pilot, right? So there's nothing to say that you can't take a CV-22 pilot, put him into the cockpit real time with the guys that are doing the mission, and have him kind of assist in, hey, looking for an HLZ, or here's what we're looking for, and things like that. And so that's what we call by importing talent. We're just kind of starting to explore the nature of that, what that looks like, and the limitations of that. But that's an advantage to an unmanned aircraft, is at any point you can take someone and throw them into the cockpit at any given time and provide expertise that you might not normally have from there. Kind of answering your question, what situation would you favor one over the other? Gosh, I mean, it depends, right? I would argue that if you're talking about stuff that starts to get kind of, you know, deep behind enemy lines, and you're talking about, you know, high level risk to force, well, that's where the, you know, the MQ-9 and the unmanned side of the house shines, because you're not putting, you know, an American body at risk. You're able to get in there a little bit quieter, a little bit smaller of a footprint, that sort of thing. If you're talking about, you know, supporting directly guys on the ground, you know, near, you know, like the forward line of troops, your unmanned or your manned is probably going to be just a slightly stronger asset, depending on the mission set. And again, these are very generic stereotypes we're kind of looking at right there, but it's very situationally dependent. But in an ideal world, you kind of have a mix of both.
Absolutely, yeah. And I got to imagine the cost of the MQ-9's got to be a little less.
Yeah, no, you bring up a great point. That I forget the numbers off the top of my head, so I don't want to spout off something that's really silly. But I think we looked at one point. I think you did this in in one of the papers I wrote. Kind of the cost per flying hour on an MQ-9 sits in that, you know, $1,000 range, you know, 5,000-6,000 ish. And if you look at even an F-16, which is not nearly as expensive as our newest, you know, 5th generation fighters, it's sitting around, you know, $60,000-$65,000 an hour to operate. And so, you know, we're taking a hard look at what we're using those aircraft for, and making sure that we're not overextending kind of our tip of the spear aircraft during mission sets that they just don't need to be doing, type deal.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's the pros and the cons. Now, how about actually flying? So you've actually got to fly each one of these things. So how similar, how dissimilar is operating a remote pilot aircraft versus, you know, being in the actual cockpit of a manned aircraft? And then if you could talk a little bit about the roles of, you know, flying an MQ-9. So the three main roles: the remote pilot aircraft pilot, the sensor operator, and the JTAC, and how they communicate with each other on a mission.
Yeah, so the similar dissimilar thing, I'll tell you a funny story. So I remember my first time when I flew the MQ-9, and you know, I got in, and I had a ton of manned habits. And just like we were talking a little bit earlier about breaking habits, well, there are some manned habits that help you, but there are more that hurt you when it comes to flying unmanned. And so I just went back to what I knew. So the one of the things that just blew my mind, I still remember this, is, you know, if you're flying a manned aircraft and I push the throttle up, you know, the plane accelerates, right? And you get, so if I'm going to climb, you know, I lead with throttle, right? These are some of the basics everyone knows. Well, that's not true in an RPA, in an MQ-9. There's a lot of computer systems that are doing things for you. So I still remember the first time I got in this, and we're trying to go through these profiles, and I need to accelerate, right? So I push the throttle up in an MQ-9, and like nothing happens. Like it just sits there at the same speed. And I was like, what? Why are we not accelerating? And you know, the instructor's like, well, you idiot, did you not read the manual? Like, you're in autopilot, you know, this hold mode, and because you're in this hold mode, the computer's making the decision for you, and you're not, and that does nothing. Like, you can do that, you can move the throttle up and down all day long, you're not going to accelerate. And I was like, okay, I need to unlearn a couple things here, you know. And that's just the nature of it. And it took a while, because there's just so many things that I had natural habit patterns for, that I'm just like, it does not apply in an MQ-9. Like it's just a different beast of a machine. And so and you can't, it's a bit sensitive too, compared to manned aircraft. So with a manned aircraft, you know, the PC-12, I mean, you know, you can throw that thing around pretty aggressively if you need to, and put it where it needs to go. Well, with an unmanned, you know, you're operating through some satellite linkages, and so you can't just throw that thing left and right. You're going to get what are called link hits, and it's going to cause the plane to kind of, you know, malfunction, and it's going to be delayed. So I was rough initially, because I'm just flying this thing like I think it's meant to be flown. Everyone's like, hey, you need to finesse this thing. Like, you need to be gentle. This is your baby right now, you know, and you can't be throwing it around like you're trying to throw it around, or it's not going to like you. And so there was a lot for me, honestly, to unlearn. And I remember I was in a class with just all guys that had only come up through that unmanned pipeline, and they took to it like that, right? I mean, I was so far behind them when we started, because I had to unlearn all these things, and they're just like, sir, you need to go into this menu to change your altitude, not try to, you know, pull back on the stick. That's not going to do anything. And I'm just like, okay, I got a lot more here to relearn. But the similarities, and as much as I talked about how dissimilar they are, it is still a cockpit, and you are still flying. And so winds still matter. Angle of bank still matters. I still use, if I need to get it around a turn, I'm still kicking in a ton of rudder to wrap it around a turn. All 60 to run one rule still applies. All those things still apply. One of the things though that is monumentally harder, and this is the hardest thing that I think that for anyone that, especially if you're coming from a man background, is you don't have any of those environmental cues that you're used to flying a manned aircraft. You just have the screen. And so if I'm flying a manned aircraft and I get distracted, which was frequently, right? That's the nature of flying, is getting distracted and then recover from being distracted. Mm-hmm. If I let the aircraft, I was heads down, pulling up an approach or so, whatever, and the aircraft got nose down a little bit and started to accelerate, I would sense that and hear it before I would see the airspeed, right? Yeah. You feel the wind rush, you start to hear it, and you're like, oh crap, what's the aircraft doing? Oh, I'm an idiot, I'm low, Or hey, if I put it on autopilot and I feel it, I go heads down to do something, I know it's going to level off in 1,000 feet. I feel that kind of negative G as it comes up. Mm-hmm. You don't have any of that when you're flying an RPA. And so it's a lot harder in that regard, because unless you're looking at the screen, looking at the numbers, you don't get any of those environmental cues of like, hey, the plane's doing something I don't want it to do right now. It just doesn't happen. So your cross check just has to constantly be back on that screen to see airspeed, to see altitude, to see what the plane's doing, because it's not going to give you those peripheral cues of like, hey, this is doing something that doesn't feel right now. I mean, whether you're upside down in a 60 degrees nose dive or like straight and level, it's going to be the same. The only difference is going to be looking at the numbers and interpreting them and being like, oh, we're upside down right now and way fast, so that's just different. Does that make sense? It's kind of
absolutely.
Yeah. Transitioning on to the roles a little bit. Pilot, RPA pilot just does what normal pilots do, right? So working airspace clearances, making sure the aircraft is where it needs to be at the right altitude, putting it in a position so that the sensor operator off on the side can kind of do his job. And all the weaponeering type stuff goes through the pilot. So fusing, thinking about impact angles, all that kind of stuff. On the sensor operator side of the house, they're manipulating the sensor that's over there. So they're always working to maximize and optimize the picture that we're pushing out through that sensor. There's all kinds of environmental factors that come into that. And so they're always working to do that. And then on the weaponeering side of the house, they're the ones that are providing a lot of that end game laser energy, things like that. So they're the ones that have all the pressure on them to make sure that, we're hitting the target that we're supposed to be hitting. And so they're doing all that on their side of the house. That is the cockpit, those two alone. Now you reference a JTAC there. So, a JTAC, for those that are unfamiliar, is an individual on the ground. It's a joint terminal attack controller. And those are guys that traditionally are embedded with ground units that are calling in airstrikes. So those are the guys that are kind of down there that are trained to know what assets they have overhead, know what targets that they're trying to prosecute. And they're the ones that are kind of given the direction of, hey, I need you to hit this here. What kind of weaponeering are you thinking? I'm thinking this, and that sort of thing. That's how they've traditionally operated. As our counter VEO fight has kind of transformed and morphed a little bit, we've been able to pull them back off the front lines and use technology where they're able to actually do that away from the front lines, looking at screens and seeing target sets and able to call in strikes from there. So it's a little bit of a different game than what it used to be from that aspect of it. As far as communicating with one another, pilot and sensor operators sitting right next to each other, you're on headset. It's just like sitting next to a co-pilot. You're just talking back and forth with that. With a JTAC, we can talk on the radios with them if they're there on the ground. That's probably our least preferred method to talk with them on, just because, again, our radio limitation comes into play there. So one of the other advantages about MQ-9s is we can throw telephones in the cockpit. And so we have literally a phone right there, and you can just pick up and call somebody and talk to them that way. And if you're asking me if I'd rather, push a button on a secure radio and hope that the crypto's working and hope that it's traveling through the 6 different satellites it needs to happen to talk to a guy on the ground, or just pick up and call someone on a hard line, what my answer is going to be for that. It's so much easier. And so those are two of the ways that we communicate. Again, as technology has kind of transformed warfare, we also have a lot of text messaging apps and things like that. Obviously secure, that we'll use to communicate and things of that nature. But those are kind of a small sampling of what we use to talk back and forth.
Awesome. So now, while you're flying these things, what's the effective range in which you can operate a remote piloted aircraft, and are there any limiting factors?
Yeah. So just like you and I can pick up a Zoom chat and dial into someone in China and have maybe a 1 or 2 second delay and talk with them halfway across the world, that's kind of where we're at right now with RPAs. And so there really is no limitation in that sense. I mean, through the magic of fiber optics, the internet, and black pixie dust, we're able to make some magic happen and operate them at some pretty extreme ranges. right now we're kind of at a point where taking off and landing with them does require kind of a team that's local that handles that aspect of the mission separately. We're transitioning to the point where that's going to kind of be automated and get to the point where that's kind of a button you push. But we're not quite there yet. And so that's really about all the limiting factors that we have right now.
Wow, amazing. So what does a typical day in the life of a remote pilot aircraft pilot look like?
Yeah, that's a good one. So typically you'll show up, you kind of do like 20 minutes of what I'll call like administrivia, where you look over some read files and you kind of make sure that you're current and that all your I's are checked, your T's are crossed, things of that nature. And that's all happens in kind of one area. And then you walk over, and this takes on different flavors depending on the unit, but you walk over to kind of the operations center. And so generally what that looks like is kind of a bigger area with, a bunch of screens up on the wall, just kind of how you picture it would look like. And that's kind of the hub of the RPA operations center. And so you walk into there, and typically in there, you'll get a brief from like an intel troop who will kind of give you a brief on what you're going to do that day, what the mission is, all the different intelligence that goes into that. You'll kind of at that point talk to weather either remotely, or they'll have someone there and just kind of get a sense of, again, what the weather's going to be when you're out there conducting the mission. And then you'll kind of step, and there's generally someone that's kind of in charge of the ops room, and you'll talk to them just about, hey, have there been any issues with any of the GCSs? Is there any systems that are down, things of that nature? And you gather all your intel then for the mission. And that takes anywhere from, 20 to 30 minutes. And then you brief as a crew. And again, that takes on different flavors depending on the mission, but it's always your pilot and your sensor operator, and there might be one or two additional folks you're going to brief along with you. And then you step to what we call the GCS, the ground control station, which is generally co-located right there. And then when you walk in, one of two things are going to happen. Either the plane is not taken off yet, and you're going to sit in the seat and set it all up to gain it. So after that kind of local unit that I talked about gets it off the ground, you kind of grab it from them and you go out and you do the mission. Or the plane's already been up in the air for a couple hours, and you're going to do a change out with the crew that's already in the seat. So you kind of go over their shoulder, you'll build your SA, see what's going on, and kind of do a brief with them, and then you jump in the seat. And then again, this is where it takes on many different flavors depending on the unit, but some units kind of fly for 4 hours, take 2 hours off, come back and fly for another 2 or 3. Some go just 6 hours straight, and they take maybe 2 or 3 breaks in there, but it kind of looks like some flavor of that. And then after you're done with your mission, you either give it back to land it, or another crew is going to come in to relieve you, and they'll jump in the seat. And then you go and you debrief with your sensor operator and anyone else appropriately. Anything you learned that day, standard debrief items for a mission. And then that's it. You wrap it up, do some paperwork, and head on home.
Cool. How many missions or hours, I guess, would a RPA pilot be flying in a typical month?
Yeah, great question. So if you're deployed, and I'll talk about that in a minute, because that's actually transitioned quite a bit in the past year, how we do deployments. You're looking at around 100 hours-ish a month, probably anywhere between 80 and 120. I'd say average around 100. If you're not deployed, it's going to be significantly less than that. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, for the first, I'm talking 19 years of how we did this, you were always deployed. And so what that looked like was when you came to an operational MQ-9 flying squadron, you got on the line after your training, and whether that schedule was 4 days on, 2 days off, or 5 days on, 1 day off, whatever that looked like, you did that nonstop for your first 4 to 5 years. And some folks did it longer than that. Well, that's unsustainable. I mean, if you talk about a quality of life, I mean, that is hard to do, because you're essentially deployed for 4 or 5 years is what it amounts to, because you're working obviously shift work and everything else like that. And so I know when I first came in, that was the one thing coming from a manned aircraft background, where we were deployed all the time in a U-28, but there was some semblance of a routine where, hey, we deployed, we came home, we deployed, we came home, that sort of thing. That was not true of the RPA world. And so we've pushed really hard over the past 4 or 5 years to get to what we call a deploy to dwell model, where we've tried to advertise, look, it's a misnomer to think that when you are flying RPAs, because you get to go home and sleep in your bed, that's basically like being at home all the time, and you can do that continuously for 5 years. It is not, even the slightest sense. And coming from a man background, I 100% agree with that. It's not the same. I would have rather been on a U-28 cycle any day than what that MQ-9 world was like for the first 4 or 5 years I was there. So what we've gotten to the point where just recently we've said, okay, we're going to do a deploy to dwell construct, very similar to how the manned aircraft do it, where you're going to deploy and fly the combat lines on those schedules for 2, 3, 4 months. and then you're going to come back and you're going to do kind of some local flying training sims, things like that for 2-3 months, and then you're going to kind of go back and forth on a 1-to-1 ratio with that. We think that's more sustainable. And to be honest, even the 1-to-1 is something that we're trying to push to a 2-to-1 and eventually a 3-to-1, just because it's going to be more sustainable for folks in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So is there any types of missions where a new RPA pilot would be flying versus someone, such as yourself with many years of manned and unmanned experience?
Not really. There's a few exceptions to that, but to be honest, the day you step onto the line as a new MQ-9 guy, we're expecting you to be able to do the mission. And so the only exceptions to that would be, I would say, some of the flight stuff that we do where we talk about a formation of 3 or 4. We're not going to expect somebody brand new with not a lot of hours to lead a formation their first day. We just haven't trained them to that point where they could do that, because when you're leading a formation, you're worried about more than just your aircraft, obviously. And there's some newer technology things that we'll get down that we might be kind of more in the experimental side of the house. And we might say, hey, let's have one of our experienced guys fly with this new technology for a flight or two, just so they can kind of feel that a little bit more. Mm-hmm. But I mean, to be honest, outside of that, that's about it. Everything else on day one, we're kind of expecting folks to be able to do.
Awesome. So you led into this question with the formation flying there. So How much more difficult is it to fly a mission with a coordinated fleet of maybe, let's say, 3 or 4 remote piloted aircraft?
Yeah, it's more difficult. It's just because, you got to there's a lot of care and feeding involved. And the idea behind a flight is that you create an effect that is greater than the sum of all parts. So you can throw, 3 or 4 RPAs, MQ-9s at a given mission set and just say, okay, do this. But if you're not integrated and you're not talking and you're not balancing each other, you're no greater than the sum of your parts. You're just 4 disparate units right now that are trying to accomplish a mission. The real synchronization comes when you are, briefing as a flight. You're talking about your roles beforehand. You're balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. When one guy's on this side, the other guy makes sure he's on this side. When this guy's out of weapons, this guy's immediately going to be coming in for reattacks because he still has them on board. All that kind of stuff comes into play, and that involves, setting up briefs appropriately, kind of working through that, having a flight lead, that's leading that formation, that kind of thing. So it's just a more complex level of integration, of flying, of leadership, of all those sorts of things. And we get our guys there eventually, but we're never expecting a guy right out of the pipeline to be able to do that. We want guys right out of the pipeline to be able to, put the thing on the thing, put the aircraft where it needs to be, and then we'll progress them to the point where they have that extra awareness to kind of be able to do a lot of the integration stuff we've been doing lately.
Absolutely. We had a question come in. Does the United States Air Force utilize other types of RPA that do not require paved runway surfaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're always looking to innovate. We're always looking to take the next step, and we're always looking to improve upon the capabilities of the aircraft. And so I'll kind of leave it at that, if that makes sense. And there's always room to think a little bit further in how we're implementing and what we want the aircraft to do. Unfortunately, I can't answer any more than that, but we're always looking for things like that for sure.
Awesome. We understand that. So you mentioned in one of your articles from the Colonel John Boyd's OODA loop. What does this stand for, and how could this acronym be applied in a successful mission?
Yeah, so the OODA loop, the infamous, if you will, Colonel John Boyd, stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And really, ironically enough, the Marine Corps kind of adopted it more than the Air Force did when he came out with it. But it's a decision-making process, and the idea behind it is that when you're faced with a human opponent, you sometimes, if you are more agile, the agility will allow you to kind of work against maybe some raw power deficiencies that you have. And so to speak more plainly, it's a way to make decisions quickly to allow you to have an advantage over your adversary. And so how he applied it was, in an air-to-air sense. Okay, so I'm observing what my counterpart is doing. I'm orienting myself using past experiences, prior knowledge towards creating decisions. I'm then synthesizing those decisions. I'm hypothesizing really quickly which one of those decisions I want to walk down, and then I'm going to go ahead and act. And then I'm immediately going to get back into that observe cycle again. This is a continual loop. And so how that kind of applies to a successful mission from an aviation standpoint, regardless of whether your adversary is, an opponent in the air, or whether it's, the weather out ahead of you that you're trying to figure out how you're going to deal with. It's just about staying ahead of the aircraft. And I know we preach that a lot in the Air Force. Hey, what should I be thinking about next? If you're sitting in the aircraft and you're just fat, dumb, and happy, something is probably going to happen terribly wrong really quickly. There's always something to be doing, and there's always your next thing to be thinking about. And so the OODA loop for me is just a way to kind of preach that of, okay, hey, what information do you need to be processing right now in your head so you don't get behind the aircraft here and find yourself, on the backside of the power curve, as we like to say, trying to figure out what happened and why things are happening so quickly. It's always good to be ahead. And that's just a way to kind of talk about, hey, how do you get ahead? What are you thinking about right now?
Yep. Always want to stay ahead of the aircraft. So what will it take for the military remote pilot aircraft community to exit the Wright brothers stage of technological advancing, or do you believe that we are currently exiting that stage now?
Yeah, I think we're exiting that stage now, to be honest. I think that we're there. It's taken us a while to get there, but I think if you look at, like we talked about earlier, that kind of every 6 months we're kind of innovating and looking at how we change the aircraft. I think we've exited kind of that Wright brothers stage. If the Wright brothers stage was, putting an MQ-1 overhead Afghanistan circa 2001, and then, throwing a missile on it that was meant to be put on a helicopter and seeing if we could shoot it off and all that kind of stuff. I think we're there. If you look at what we did then to what we can do now, the types of operations that we're undertaking, the parameters that we're holding ourselves to, the narrow windows of opportunity that we're able to exploit now that we couldn't even dream about exploiting some of these windows, even honestly, 5, 6, 7 years ago. We've come a long, long way. And that goes back to all that technology and training we talked about earlier. So I think we're exiting pretty quickly what that was. And so now obviously the next question is, well, what's next and what does that look like after this?
Yeah, that is the next question. You hit it on the head. So with the advancement in technology, how we're going, every 6 months you're talking about we're getting better and better. What will the scope of the United States military remote pilot aircraft fleet look like maybe a decade from now?
Yeah, so that's $1 million question, and I'm going to take the easy way out initially and say that I don't know, but it's going to look a lot different than what we have right now.
Yep.
And so I think as we look at this problem of like, what's next? What does it look like a decade from now? We need to be careful about looking at it from a platform-centric viewpoint. And what I mean by that is looking at it from the MQ-1 looked like this. Then we came up with the MQ-9, which was a bigger, faster, could hold more weapons version. So that means MQ next needs to be even bigger, even faster, and hold even more weapons. I think we need to be cognizant that isn't necessarily the right path to walk down. And I'm going to pull from a paper that our CSAF, our Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Brown, recently released called Accelerate, Change, or Lose. And what he talked about in there was we need to think about kind of capabilities more than anything else. And so what that means is as we kind of transition away from the focus of the U.S. military being solely that counter VEO war on terror fight, and as we shift a little bit here towards that near peer competition where we're looking at China, we're looking at Russia, and we're transitioning over towards what the National Defense Strategy has kind of instructed us to transition over to, we look at what do we want capabilities-wise from our next RPA. And so we go there, and then we kind of walk the dog back and say, okay, what does that look like then when we decide what capabilities we want? Because maybe we don't need a shooter like that. Maybe we need something that does ISR better, but maybe what that looks like is we have like a mothership RPA who has all kinds of intelligent wingmen, like mini RPAs kind of attached to them, and you operate as like a quarterback, and I can sit back there in the mothership and say, okay, RPA 1, I need you to go take a picture of that. RPA 2, I need you to go follow that vehicle around a little bit. And you kind of multitask. And maybe that's what the next version looks like, which is a drastic change from, what an MQ-9 would look like. But if we define the capability first and we look for, hey, what do we need in this near peer fight? What do we need an unmanned aircraft to provide for us? Then we can kind of, again, we can walk back and say, okay, this is what it needs to look like then. So I know that was like a really kind of like big picture look at this, and you wanted just like a, hey, what is it going to look like and how fast is it going to go? But I think that's where we kind of find ourselves behind that OODA loop of our adversaries when we're thinking just platform centric type stuff.
Yeah, I'm excited and interested to see what the future has to hold for it. But another question came in asking if you ever had an opportunity on the Global Hawk.
Yeah, I have not personally. No, that's that aircraft we were talking about earlier. I have not. I have some friends that have. The Global Hawk is what we call our strategic ISR platform. In comparison to the MQ-9, we call that our tactical ISR platform. And we don't need to dive into kind of the details of the differences, but it's a very different aircraft, very different capabilities, very different strengths and weaknesses. And I have personally not had a chance to fly one of those.
So with all the advancements that we are currently seeing in remote piloted aircraft, do you believe that the RPA will take over the commercial aviation industry, replacing the need for pilots in the future?
Great question. So this is obviously just my personal opinion, and that's what has been true of this entire thing we've done. I speak not for the for the Air Force or the DoD writ large. I believe eventually, yes. I think what you'll see though is I think you'll see baby steps in that direction, and I think you'll see it more from a commercial side of the house where you're talking about the transportation of goods first before you'll see it from the human side of the house. And here's why. You know, a lot of folks try to compare it to like Tesla and what Tesla's doing and what Elon Musk is doing with vehicles and automated driving and things like that. Here's where that kind of analogy falls apart though for me. If I'm in a car, anyone that's getting in a car knows generally how to drive, right? Most folks that are getting in an aircraft that travel aren't pilots, you know?
Yeah.
So there's a sense of familiarity there where, hey, if I get in a car and it starts to do stuff I don't like, I can take it over and I have control. That doesn't apply in aircraft for the most part. Unless you're a pilot, you're not going to feel comfortable landing a 737 if the AI goes haywire, right? The other part of that kind of falls apart for me is, hey, if your car catches on fire, you know, you, again, unlikely, but if it happens, you pull off the side of the road and you get out of your car. If your aircraft engine catches on fire, that's a different problem set, okay? It's not quite as easy to solve. Now, that's not to say that there's not a great advantage to some of the AI stuff that's going out there. But the other part of this is the business side, right? So if I'm Delta and I'm United, even if I have the safest AI in the world that is leagues ahead of what a human could do from a takeoff, landing, you know, cruising, solving emergencies, even if I have that answer, I have to convince the general public that I have that answer. And, you know, Delta and United and those guys, they're not running charities and they're not running nonprofits. They have to be able to sell tickets. And if no one's going to get on the aircraft because it's not, there's not a human pilot on there, they can have all that technology, but they got to be able to sell it first. And so I think maybe what you'll see, you might see some baby steps. I think, you know, like FedEx, I think would be probably the first one out the door that would be able to do something like this fully unmanned with an aircraft like that. I think you might see maybe, you know, hey, I'm the captain, I'm up here in the aircraft, but my co-pilot is flying remotely right now. You know, you might kind of see a baby step in that direction. He's operating out of a GCS at the airport type deal. You know, and I think you'll maybe see walks in that direction. But I think it's going to be a while until we see just folks getting on and somebody, you know, flying it remotely without anyone in the cockpit.
Yeah, absolutely. So what advice would you give, wrapping it up here, to our young viewers, young listeners now, maybe just getting into the world of aviation, looking to be successful in their future careers?
Yeah, so two things kind of come to mind for me. I think first and foremost is chase your own dreams, not someone else's. And what I mean by that is that find what you're passionate about when it comes to flying and pursue that. And I think a lot of times, you know, we get caught up sometimes in the flying bug of, especially on the civilian side of the house, of, well, I want to be a captain, you know, for Delta on an Airbus or whatnot. And I know nothing about the commercial aviation industry, so if Delta doesn't fly Airbuses, then I'm just going to, you know, please forgive me for that. This is not my expertise, obviously. But I think we get too caught up in maybe saying, oh, that's what I got to do. And there's nothing worse in life than waking up someday and realizing you chased somebody else's dream. So if that's your dream to fly commercially for the airlines, then by all means pursue it. But if your dream is to fly, you know, crop dusters, or your dream is to fly missionary type trips or to do smaller aircraft type stuff, then pursue that. Find what you enjoy doing and chase after that. Don't feel like someone else needs to kind of define your dream or base it off of what you think you can make financially or anything like that. And I'm a little bit of an example of that, right? I mean, I gave up a fighter aircraft to go fly a single engine turboprop, which made sense to zero people at the time. And I was called some pretty horrendous names for it. And then I gave up flying a manned aircraft to go fly unmanned. But that was because I I wanted a chance to do something different, to see a different side of the house. I saw a lot of opportunity there in the unmanned side from what we could do with the aircraft. And in between you and I, when I'm done flying for the military, I will never fly commercially for the airlines. Again, me personally, I have no desire to do that ever. That does not appeal to me. And so what I would much rather do is kind of fly on the side a little bit, maybe help out at a local airport, maybe do some missionary flying. I have a ton of experience flying small single engine aircraft in Africa and things of that nature. And so that's kind of more what I would like to do. And so I'd encourage folks, number one, first and foremost, to find what you love to do and pursue that, and don't let anyone else define your dream. And the second piece of that, I would say, is don't be intimidated if you have zero background flying getting into it. I mean, I had absolutely none, right? I mean, I didn't come from a place where there's a big airport. The only time I'd flown before I entered pilot training was like commercially on 1 or 2 flights, and so I had no experience whatsoever. I did not have, a family that was full of aviators. I was really intimidated, I'll be honest, when I went to pilot training, and I was surrounded by, 30 other guys and gals whose, parents flew for the airlines, or whose parents were retired, officers in the military who were fighter pilots, and folks that had gone to the academy and had all this kind of experience. And I was just like, my goodness, like, I'm going to fail out of this program because I know absolutely nothing. Like, I don't know the difference between IFR, VFR. I don't know anything these acronyms mean. I don't know anything. But what I found is that, like most things in life, if you just apply yourself and you're willing to work hard and sacrifice some of your personal time to get better, you can do it. And so I'd encourage anyone to don't be intimidated at all if you feel like, hey, I don't have a family, I don't have a background. Everyone starts at ground zero at some point, and so don't let that intimidate folks from kind of getting into the aviation business if that's something you want to pursue.
Yeah, amazing, good advice there. One last question came in. Does the United States Air Force require remote pilots to have a college education?
Oh man, that's a hotly debated topic, and so there's 2 parts to that. For the MQ-9 right now, yes, all of our pilots are officers, and all officers are required to have a bachelor's degree. We've experimented recently with the enlisted pilot program, and so without going too deep into that, we talked about the Global Hawk. We've kind of limited right now that experimental program to Global Hawks, and saying that our first enlisted aviators are going to fly just that aircraft and just that aircraft alone. And so we're kind of in the experimental stages of what that looks like right now. I will say, though, that all those folks that applied for that initial batch to be our first ever kind of enlisted pilots, I don't know this for a fact, but I knew 1 or 2 of them, and they both had their bachelor's degree at that point, because the program just to get into was very competitive. And so even on the enlisted side of the house, there was a lot of people that wanted to do that, to be the first enlisted pilots. And so one of the ways they can kind of narrow it down is, okay, who has their associate's degree, who has their bachelor's degree, that sort of thing. And so even on that side of the house, it was pretty competitive. And again, I don't want to speak for certainty because I don't know for sure, but I know at least a few of them, if not all of them, had their bachelor's degree already tied up. And so, it is a requirement right now, and it's something that I encourage folks to do. And for a lot of folks, that means enlisting initially and then using the GI Bill and kind of the advantages and the benefits that provides to go to college and get their degree. But the Air Force is, rightly so, very big on folks getting their degree and promotes that extensively. And so I'd encourage folks that are interested in doing that to still pursue that route as well.
Great. Well, awesome stuff, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you again for everything that you do for our great nation. And
yeah,
we'll save a spot for you at the Grassfield Landing Championship on the 20th.
Excellent. That was the only thing I needed you to say at the end of this, was that I still had a spot in there. So excellent. This was a successful interview, then we'll call it. So no, it was great. I really appreciate the opportunity. And, it was awesome just to sit here and chat with you a little bit and to get the message out and to help folks in any way that I can to kind of pursue what their dream might be. So yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity. It was great, Logan.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Have a nice night.
Hey, thanks, you too. See ya.
Yep. Bye-bye. All right, guys, that is it. We will see you again next time. And don't forget, on the 20th, we got the Grassfield Landing Championship. Bring your A game, some friendly competition, and try to take home the gold. We'll see you next time. Thank you.